Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Briancrombie Radio Hour on Saga Night 60. I think we're in day 17 of the Russia-Ukrainian war. I wanted to check in with Marcus Kolga, who is a expert on what's going on in Eastern Europe. He is a senior fellow with Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's a principal consultant with LIFA Communications. He's the founder and publisher of something called upnorth.eu. He's been in the past a film producer. He's got an incredible academic background. He's a writer, and he's been very active in the last little while in researching, communicating with, and commenting on what's going on in not only Ukraine and Russia, but Eastern Europe, because he's personally his background is from the Baltic states, and so he thinks about this from a very personal standpoint, as from an academic and commenting communication standpoint. Marcus, welcome to the show. You were saying you're pretty tired.
Yeah, it's day 17. It's been 17 days of just giving briefings, interviews, morning till night. I don't want to compare myself to some of these Ukrainian community leaders who are really, I don't know how they're doing it at this point, but it's exhausting. We're continuing the fight, and we need to explain to Canadians exactly what's going on in Ukraine, what Putin is, what his intentions are, and to make sure that everyone is aware of the disinformation he's trying to spread and the crimes he's committing.
Okay, so let's break this down. The disinformation he's trying to spread. What disinformation is he trying to spread?
Well, of course, he's trying to break down Western support for Ukraine, sort of full time, trying to ensure that we don't send lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine. He's also trying to justify his own war to his own people at this point. Things are not going to plan for Vladimir Putin, and so he's constantly trying to make sure that his people maintain that support, those around him, the oligarchs, certainly his security apparatus. And there's been some really disturbing reports coming out of Russia, Russian state media. There are these fabricated reports that the U.S. that the Russian forces have discovered abandoned U.S. and Ukrainian joint biological warfare plants, which these didn't exist, and there are very serious concerns today that these false reports will be used by the Russian government when they may engage in the use of chemical warfare, biological warfare against Ukrainian urban centers, and point to these non-existent biological factories and such that they claim the U.S. has worked on with the Ukrainians in efforts to blame them for a Russian potential chemical or biological warfare attack on Ukraine.
I spoke to some people just recently that are from Russia, and they said that number one, the propaganda in Russia is working, and number two, Putin believes his own propaganda. What do you think of that?
Well, it does seem that there is significant support for Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine. Let's not forget that the Russian people have been hermetically, essentially sealed off from outside media. There is no independent media anymore in Russia. Any sort of foreign broadcast, whether it's the BBC or CNN, anything like that, has been blocked both on the internet and on television and satellite. And so there is no factual, truth-based information that the Russian people are receiving at this point. So Vladimir Putin is able to completely control the narrative about the war, and of course, he is claiming that this is there's no war at all. That this is a small denazification operation, a very limited denazification operation against Ukraine. And his claims are that Ukraine has somehow threatened or is threatening to invade Russia, and that this is almost like a preemptive attack. And it's unfortunate that at least half of the population of Russia believes this, because they have no access to any real information. So it's certainly a problem, and it's one that I think the Western world needs to address. We need to start thinking of ways to get good information into Russia, whether it's by amplifying our shortwave broadcasts, figuring out ways to beam in the internet, circumventing those sort of censors, so that they get some of the truth and the facts of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine.
I've spoken to only a handful, but a handful of people that have got family members in Russia, and they're saying they're in constant contact. So I'm not sure how they're doing it, whether it's telephone or text or messenger or whatnot, but families are communicating back and forth.
Well, and this is one way that I think that we can communicate facts and truth back to Russia. I mean, Vladimir Putin hasn't shut off the phone lines. He hasn't shut off people's cell phones. If I were a Canadian trying to contact family in Russia, I would be concerned about what's being said at this point. We don't know how far Vladimir Putin's repressive sort of organs are going into. We know they're blocking television. We know that they're censoring the internet. Whether they start monitoring communications, who knows? But at least there is that ability that we can speak with families in Canada, can speak directly with their families in Russia. And there have been some interesting new sort of initiatives that have that are trying to use this opportunity of calling into Russia. There's a Call Russia platform that was opened recently, whereby anyone can go in there and press this button. It will randomly call a Russian telephone number, and if you speak Russian, you can tell the person on the other line a little bit of the truth of what's happening in Ukraine. So these sorts of interesting initiatives have popped up over the past few days.
There was some media reports that some group called Anonymous had actually been able to broadcast on top of or interrupt Russian TV. Is that real? I saw that report as well. This is a few days ago, where Anonymous, this is a hacker group, what is called generally a white hat hacker group. These are computer programming experts that use their skills to try and do something good in the world. So what they did is they hacked into Russian state media, and as you mentioned, they took over a broadcast and started broadcasting a bit of the truth. I mean, this didn't last for very long, but Anonymous has been quite effective in tapping into Russian state media over the past, not just domestically, but they also took down RT, the Russian government's external news media platform. They took that down in the early days of the war. We're chatting tonight with Marcus Kolga, who is an expert on what's going on in Eastern Europe, particularly, obviously, today, Russia, Ukraine, and the war. But he's also an expert on the risks that NATO, the EU, the West has in regards to Russian aggression. Prior to the start of the war, I interviewed you, Marcos, as you may remember, and you warned against that if we didn't stop Putin at Ukraine, that the Baltics would be next. I want to take a break for some messages and come back more and talk a little bit about the risks of not stopping Putin now with Marcus Kolga. Stay with us, everybody.
Gotcha.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is an expert on Eastern Europe. Marcus Kolga is his name. He works with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's previously been a filmmaker. He's from Eastern Europe, from the Baltics, and he has been a thinker on the risks associated with Russian aggression. Marcos, you came on my show before this all started and warned me and us about what would happen, and we didn't know if Putin would do anything. Actually, the world didn't, but you probably did, because you said he was going to do something, and you said that we had to stop him now, otherwise he would move on, and we'd end up having. I don't think you called it World War III, but you said we'd have a larger issue. Fiona Hill, who I understand is one of the experts on Russia. She was one of the people that testified against President Trump during the impeachment trials. She's a Russian U.S. security expert. Said last week that World War III started in 2014, maybe even 2008, but for sure in 2014, when we didn't do something then. And I guess that was Crimea and invasions into two different places in eastern Ukraine. Has World War III already started? What do you think of that?
Well, it gives me no pleasure to say that, I told you so. And a lot of us did already going back to, 2007 and earlier. There were signs of the direction that Vladimir Putin was pulling his country in already when he took power in 2000. In order to bolster support, he manufactured a crisis with Chechnya. He manufactured various different terrorist bombings in apartment blocks around Russia. We know this because the explosives that were found, the unexploded ordnances that were found in the basements of a number of apartment buildings, this is in 1999, in fact, had the markings of the FSB. This is the Russian intelligence organization, the successor to the KGB. And so we were already seeing these sorts of signs early on. In 2006, there were a number of journalists, Anna Politkovskaya, who's a very well-known one, who these were journalists who were critical of Vladimir Putin and his war against Chechnya. They were assassinated. In 2007, Vladimir Putin tried to destabilize Estonia, where my grandparents are from. He manufactured rioting, ethnic-based rioting, and engaged in the first ever government-sponsored cyber warfare against Estonia, which took down the websites in the banking sector, government and media and such. And then, of course, in 2008, we saw the Russian invasion of Georgia. Moving forward to 2014, he invaded Crimea. And eastern Ukraine. In all of those cases, we did very little. The signs were very clear. Vladimir Putin was becoming more and more aggressive. He has geopolitical neo-imperialist ambitions, and we did nothing. We imposed no costs. The deterrence was minimal. Thankfully, NATO, after the 2014 invasion, 2 years later, engaged in these operations in the Baltics, set up these bases. Canada, of course, sending troops to Latvia to try and deter Vladimir Putin. I'm not sure that this is enough, given what we've seen, this barbaric invasion of Ukraine, which isn't entirely strategic either. And this is, I think, a big problem. You and I talked about this before the war, and we sort of talked about what Vladimir Putin might be seeking to achieve. Had he held his forces in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, stopped there, turned around to his people and said, here's a victory for you. I saved this portion of Ukraine, which is really part of Russia, and the Russian speakers there. That would have been strategic. It would have been understandable had he done that. The fact that he is engaging in these war crimes, and they're just growing every single day. We talked about the potential for a chemical attack. The fact that he is now trying to saber rattle with his nuclear weapons. This is no longer strategic. I question Vladimir Putin's state of mind. And if he's doing this in Ukraine, there's no reason to believe that he wouldn't do that in the Baltic states. Now, Vladimir Putin's forces are spread thin right now. They are all focused on Ukraine. The number of troops on the Russian border with the Baltics has decreased significantly over the past number of weeks. He simply can't have those forces there if he wants to invade Ukraine and wants to hold and actually occupy Ukraine. So for now, things are relatively quiet in the Baltic. That doesn't mean that things will change. There are several strategic points in that region that Vladimir Putin would like to obtain to stop NATO and to push back against NATO. So we need to be very prepared for a broader conflict in the future. It could be a tactical nuclear one. It could be an invasion of the Baltic states. And let's not forget that Vladimir Putin changed the constitution of his country just last summer to enable him to stay in power until 2035. He's not going away anytime soon. We have to accept the fact that he's going to be there for at least another decade, if not more, and that these sorts of conflicts are going to become the new norm. And we better be prepared to defend our democracy, NATO, against this growing threat.
I'd forgotten about Georgia, and I was reminded last week a little bit about it. And please update us if you could. President Bush at the time was very friendly and supportive of Georgia. There was a lot of economic integration, and there was some talk about Georgia actually joining either a Western alliance or NATO. Was there not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Georgia was on the same sort of westward trajectory under its president then, Mikhail Saakashvili. Saakashvili was educated in the United States and was really committed to taking Georgia into the European Union, integrating it with NATO, and becoming a truly Western state. This was obviously unacceptable to Vladimir Putin. So he manufactured a crisis in two provinces that border Russia, Abkhazia in the western part of Georgia, and South Ossetia in the north, and created a provocation, not unlike what we saw, or tried to create a provocation not unlike what we saw in Donbass 17 days ago, or just before that. And he invaded Georgia, and Russian forces have occupied those two territories ever since then. The war clearly had a destabilizing effect on Georgia itself. It has had a pro-Kremlin president for the last number of years, much to the benefit of Vladimir Putin. But what's interesting and what doesn't get reported very widely is the fact that occupation is creeping forward. Every year, Russia moves its borders. Literally, they pick up the borders and move them into Georgian territory by about 1 kilometer. So that invasion is literally continuing to this day. It is expanding. And again, the Western response to that was zero. We didn't do anything. We didn't respond appropriately to it. We certainly didn't impose any costs to stop Vladimir Putin from doing this again. And going back to your initial point, what do we need to do? We need to stop him. We need to impose those sorts of painful costs to him that would make him adjust his calculus and stop this sort of behavior. We haven't done that yet, and there's no clear sign that we will.
So I think that the argument that Fiona Hill, this Russia expert in the United States, was making is that Georgia in 2008 was sort of like the takeover of Austria prior to World War II, and then 2014 and the takeover of Crimea and the Donbass was comparable to Czechoslovakia, and by having some sanctions but nothing more, that the West was effectively responding like Chamberlain did at Munich, and we were appeasing. And the argument she was making is appeasement with a bully never works. But then the interesting analogy is that the invasion of Ukraine 17 days ago was comparable to the September 1st invasion of Poland, and World War II didn't really get started with the West for another 10 months or so until they attacked on the East. And even though we declared war, we didn't do anything. We didn't go and support Poland. And the argument was, if we knew that the millions of lives that were going to be lost between 1940 and 1945, if we knew that, we would have done more either in Czechoslovakia or in Poland. And that has to be the situation now. And so I guess the question is there any analogy there? And if that analogy exists, and you knew that there was going to be attack on the Baltics or in Moldova or in Romania or wherever else you can tell us is a logical spot, what should the West, what should NATO do now?
Look, I appreciate the analogy. I think we just have to put that aside, though. There's some relevance. We can look to history, but all we need to do is look at recent history. Like, as you mentioned, Fiona Hill's talking about Georgia, talking about when we look at what Vladimir Putin did in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, there is a clear pattern here. And the pattern has only become more concerning over the past 17 days. We can't rule out anything at this point. And so, whether it's, we're looking at 1939 or 17 days ago, it's in the West's interest right now, in Canada's interest, to make sure that we do everything possible to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. This is the front line of democracy. If we want to prevent that World War III, we need to help the Ukrainians because they're the ones that are going to do it for us. And that means ensuring that they have the weapons to do it, whether it's anti-tank weapons, surface-to-air missiles are critical right now. We need to help the Ukrainians secure their airspace. Number one, to give them a fighting chance against Russia's this upcoming invasion of Kiev. And this is going to be a bloody, bloody battle, unlike anything that we've seen since World War II, perhaps before that. But making sure that they can secure those skies above Kiev and like I said, give them a fighting chance. Also to help protect these civilian escape corridors for the refugees that are fleeing cities like Mariupol, Kharkiv, and the ones that are going to be fleeing Kiev. We've seen that Vladimir Putin has no problem with opening fire to them. He will promise a corridor and he'll send his attack helicopters up and just slaughter civilians. So sending those surface-to-air missiles is very critical. We should be sending them drones. What Canada should be doing is talking to our allies in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, in Europe, other countries who have this equipment. We know that Canada doesn't have this equipment because we've failed to really seriously equip our national defense forces. But let's work with our allies. Let's ask them to send anything they have, any equipment they have, and we can then pay to sort of backfill any equipment that they send. There are ways that we can do this to help the Ukrainians. And really the moment is now. It's not in 2 weeks. It is now. We need to do this now. We need to help the Ukrainians defend themselves.
But still not, you're arguing, get actively involved. So NATO imposing a no-fly zone above Ukraine, you wouldn't agree with?
Well, I think we need to understand that Vladimir Putin does have nuclear weapons. Is there a threat that he will use them? I believe so. I'm concerned that Vladimir Putin will use tactical nuclear weapons. These are short-range nuclear weapons that might target a city. I think he may use them regardless of whether NATO gets involved or not. NATO has to take a very close look at how Vladimir Putin is targeting refugees. I would suggest that NATO should be calling for and imposing no-fly zones over these green corridors that, to start with, to allow those refugees to flee, because we have seen Vladimir Putin openly target civilians. And so what NATO could be doing and working with the UN is to protect those corridors and those civilians and any refugees that are trying to get out of Ukraine right now.
That's a fascinating idea. I hadn't heard that before. So, a corridor is like a highway. Can you actually have can you enforce a no-fly zone that in that narrow of a lane?
Well, I'm not sure that, if the corridor is a few hundred meters wide, clearly the no-fly zone would have to be, 5 to 10, if not more kilometers wide. But there's no reason, if there's a will to do it, there's no reason why we could not do it. Again, we're protecting civilian lives here. That's what we're trying to do. We're protecting refugees. I wouldn't be surprised if we went to the UN with this, that, the UN wouldn't support it. I think the most UN countries have demonstrated that they're not supportive of Vladimir Putin's war. And so, again, protecting refugees should be the focus if we're looking at a no-fly zone right now.
You talked about some of the Eastern European countries providing lethal weapons and Canada backfilling. There is this conversation about Poland supplying big jets to Ukraine, and then Canada and the United States promising to re-equip Poland with Western jets. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think it's a great idea. I think that Joe Biden is resisting this because I think his concern is that Vladimir Putin will see this as the U.S. getting directly involved in the war. I'm not sure that that's the case. Vladimir Putin may try to make that argument. If those jets are put on the back of trucks and are shipped across the Polish border into Ukraine to an airport where Ukrainian pilots get into them and fly them. I'm not sure that is means the United States is directly getting involved. Does it mean that the United States is supporting the defense of Ukraine's airspace? I suppose so. Again, that argument, Putin might make that argument, but I think this is one very, very important way in which we can which the United States can help protect Ukraine, and certainly those civilian areas, those urban areas that are clearly being targeted by Russian forces, bombs, artillery that are indiscriminately shelling civilian infrastructure right now. That's key, and giving them the air power to help protect that airspace and those civilians is really critical at this moment.
NATO forces directly involved in Ukraine? No.
I don't see it.
Because of the concern of nuclear proliferation, nuclear attacks.
Yeah, well, let's not forget that Vladimir Putin has these short-range tactical nuclear weapons. They're lined all along his western border with NATO. These are Iskander missiles. They will take out one of these missiles could take out a city the size of Edmonton, for example. And so I think there's real concern amongst NATO states that, again, given his behavior over the last 17 days, the fact that he's using these barbaric thermobaric bombs on Ukrainian urban centers, these are missiles that fly a few hundred meters above these cities. They detonate. They suck every ounce of air and oxygen out of that blast zone, which is could be several hundred meters wide. And burns everything in sight. He's used these on civilian targets, including a maternity hospital, a children's hospital. So if he's doing that, again, you can't rule out the use of tactical nuclear weapons.
We're chatting today with Marcus Klugel, who is a expert on what's going on in Eastern Europe. He's with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Marcos in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're talking tonight with Marcus Kolga, who works with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's an expert on Eastern Ukraine. We've chatted with him before about what's going on in Eastern Europe, particularly, obviously, in regards to Ukraine. Marcos has got really quite an impressive background. He's a digital communications, global human rights, sanctions, disinformation, and cybersecurity expert. He's a writer, a documentary filmmaker, and a political activist. He comments regularly on foreign policy, international human rights, and disinformation issues in Canadian and international media, and his opinions are frequently published in Canadian national newspapers, including on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. His award-winning documentary films have been broadcast on Canadian national television and to audiences around the world. He helped lead the Canadian campaign for global Magnitsky, is that correct?
Magnitsky sanctions, yeah.
Human rights campaign, and continues to advocate internationally to expand the legislation, including testifying and briefing policymakers in Canada, Latvia, Estonia, UK, and Australia about the legislation. I read a book about this. I think it was called Red Peril. Was that
Red Notice? Red Notice.
That's right. And it was an incredibly compelling book. And this individual went to Russia to get involved in business, and I guess crossed some of Putin's and other people's paths, and ended up really being almost losing his life, but being incredibly what's the right word? His life was put in jeopardy. His businesses were put into bankruptcy. His finances were put into peril, and anyone that was associated with him was as well. And he described that not only Putin, but numerous other oligarchs and other people were the cause of it. And he argued at that time that the human rights abuses were unbelievable, and you had to put in sanctions against and these. I apologize, I can't pronounce it again. The Magnitsky.
That's right. Magnitsky. That's right.
Were, I believe, primarily sanctions against oligarchs and people in different power positions. Did they work?
Uh, well, yes, they are clearly working. So you're right. The Magnitsky sanctions that this is Bill Browder is who you're referring to. He was a U.S. investor who went to Russia in the early 2000s. Went on crusades against corruption and would invest in companies, fight the corruption within those companies, and clearly profit from them. The oligarchs in Russia, Vladimir Putin as well, weren't too happy with the kind of work that Bill was doing. And there were some officials who, while Bill was at one point in 2005 in London, basically raided his offices, took several corporate documents, stole his company, and used those documents to engage in a $230 million tax fraud against the Russian government. So these are Russian officials stealing a private company and using that company to defraud the Russian government. So Bill's lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, discovered that this was happening. He remained in Russia, even though Bill asked his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, to leave. Sergei Magnitsky discovered this tax fraud. He took that information, his investigation, to Russian tax authorities. And instead of arresting those responsible for the fraud, they imprisoned Sergei Magnitsky. They put him in prison in 2008, and he was there for a year. He was deprived of any sort of medical attention. He suffered greatly. He was tortured. He was beaten, and was eventually killed. And since that time, it's been Bill Browder's crusade to find justice by introducing the sanctioning legislation named after Sergei, the Magnitsky sanctions, which allow governments, including Canada's, to target corrupt human rights abusers with sanctioning legislation. And this is what we've been using over the past several weeks now. We should have been using it much earlier. But we've been using it to target Russian oligarchs with significant assets here in Canada and elsewhere, the UK, the United States, and elsewhere. The legislation freezes those assets. It denies those corrupt oligarchs who are very close to Putin to access those assets, and it also bans any sort of visas, so they're not able to travel to places like Canada. And just yesterday, Canada actually announced significant sanctions on one very closely linked oligarch, probably one of the wealthiest in Russia, who owns several steel plants in Western Canada. His name is Roman Abramovich. He was placed on our sanctions list and the UK sanctions list. For your football fans out there, British football fans, he owned Chelsea Football Club as well. And so the sanctions that are being imposed on him, they prohibit him from selling Chelsea Football Club or any of the assets he has here in Canada. And the hope is, at least theoretically, is that these sorts of sanctions will motivate someone like Abramovich, who has very close access to Putin. They will motivate him to talk to Vladimir Putin, tell him to stop the war, stop the barbaric violence towards Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainians in general, and to back down. So we'll see how effective they are. But we know that Putin's own reaction to sanctions, he lashes out every time we impose new sanctions. Clearly, they are painful to him, and they are working. And so we need to make sure that we continue using them. And maybe we need to start imposing sanctions on larger Russian corporations and now sectors of the Russian economy as well.
So you think these sanctions against oligarchs might work?
They are working. We know they're working. We've seen some oligarchs that are very close to Vladimir Putin peeling away from him, posting messages on their anti-war messages on their social media accounts. This is something that they would not have ever dreamed of doing a month ago, but they're now doing it. And so they're through those messages. And this is just social media messages, but it's a big deal in Russia. Don't forget, this is a country that the Putin regime engages in extreme censorship. So to have an oligarch come out and contradict Vladimir Putin, to criticize his decisions, is a big deal. And if they're doing that publicly, you can only imagine what they are doing privately. These guys are sweating bullets. We know that they're also scrambling. There are some Twitter accounts right now that are tracking the yachts and the movement of the yachts of these oligarchs. These are these are yachts that some of them have their own private anti-aircraft missile systems. These are yachts that cost, $500 million, $1 billion, like super yachts. They are scrambling right now. They are moving towards places in Africa and such, where they have no extradition treaties with Western countries. So clearly the sanctions are having an effect. These oligarchs are worried. And if they're worried enough, the hope is that they will move against Vladimir Putin and hope, at the very least, encourage him to stop this war.
McDonald's, Starbucks, et cetera, have closed down in Russia. Pepsi and Coke are not selling. Does that have any impact?
Well, yeah, it's going to have an impact. It's certainly going to have an impact in the cities amongst regular Russians. Young Russians who can no longer, buy their iPhones, can't get that Starbucks coffee. When it hits like that, when all of your conveniences are gone, and you're stuck with, eating some Russian dumplings every day, which are good. Don't get me wrong. I love Russian dumplings. But occasionally you want some Western food. If you can't have access to that, you can't have access to European cheeses, chocolates, coffees. It doesn't matter, anything like that. Eventually you're going to, we know that young Russians already would prefer a more Western lifestyle. Once all of these superficial elements that might be satisfying Russians and keeping them quiet, politically speaking, now that all of these are gone, I think that they may encourage Russians to eventually rise up as well and say enough is enough. We won't stand for this anymore, and that's going to come.
Some people
I don't think the Russian people will stand for this much longer. Some
people will retort, no, all you got to do is win in Ukraine, and then the West will remove all those sanctions and we'll be back to normal. Do you think that? Do you think that's a potential case that maybe there's a ceasefire and Putin demands all the sanctions go away?
Yeah, well, look, we can't rule that out. Is that a win then? If Putin stops, if he pulls his troops back and says, okay, fine, remove the sanctions, I suppose that's a win. The real win for the West right now is a decisive defeat of Vladimir Putin, the removal of Vladimir Putin from power. And I think ultimately we need to look at history. What happened to Germany after 1945? I think we need to, think about Russia in the same terms. Russia needs to be broken apart. Clearly, it has represented a threat for the past century. It's only getting worse again now. And we need to neutralize that threat. And we can't allow this country to have nuclear weapons. We can't allow it to continuously threaten Europe. What we need is a democratic Russia that respects the rule of law, that respects its neighbors. I think a Russia like that could be, fully integrated with the West, work together with Europe and, Canada and the United States. But that will require us to break it apart. It will require significant changes. That's the ultimate victory for I think, democracy in the Western world. But I think you're right. I think that if we can just get him to retreat and pull out of Ukraine, I think that's what we need to look at in the short term. If that means, if he does that and, maybe we need to lift those sanctions, that's fine. That's the purpose of those sanctions, is to encourage a change in behavior.
A broken up, denuclearized Russia would be spectacular, no question, and regime change would be spectacular. And maybe we're taking this analogy way too far, but I think about Hitler and how many of the German general staff disagreed with him, but still fought valiantly for him. How many assassination attempts there might have been? So not just oligarchs that wanted to encourage him to stop, but people that actually tried to assassinate Hitler that failed and that were murdered or dismissed, and how he ended up isolating himself and only listening to yes men, which would appear to have history repeating itself with Putin. And it was 5 long years and millions of lives later before finally he was crushed. And is there any hope that what what you're describing can happen when you think about, the pictures we see of Putin sitting at long tables, miles away from anyone else, isolated, some reports say, for the last 2 years during a paranoia during COVID-19, and clearly a senior military establishment, if not a political establishment as well, that are probably yes men.
Well, they're clearly yes men, and we know this given what's happened over the past 24 hours. There's the senior members of the FSB. Again, this is the successor organization to the KGB. The directors of the Foreign Intelligence Service were sacked. They weren't just sacked; they were arrested by Vladimir Putin for failing to provide proper intelligence on what was happening in Ukraine. So he's what apparently was happening over the past several months was that these FSB officials, these are senior officials, these are guys that are running the secret police essentially for Vladimir Putin. They were feeding him false information, and perhaps not intentionally so, perhaps intentionally so, but it seems likely that they were just telling Putin what he wanted to hear about Ukraine, and that false intelligence that was fed to Vladimir Putin has really resulted in his failures. Vladimir Putin had expected to take Kiev in literally 2 days. We're at day 17 right now. His forces are certainly approaching Kiev, but even if they surround Kiev, I doubt that they will take Kiev. And if they take Kiev, they will never ever be able to hold Kiev. And so, Vladimir Putin is clearly frustrated right now. There is division within the ranks. And it would be wonderful if the knives finally came out. Because the only way that we are going to end this nightmare is with regime change. Like I said, Vladimir Putin has legally changed his constitution to stay in power until 2035. It's likely he will stay there longer if he's able to. So none of this will change until there's a change in who is running that country. So I think that we all need to be praying that there are cooler minds that are going to prevail in Moscow, that they understand the threat that Vladimir Putin represents, not just to the Western world, but to Russia. Let's not forget, he is destroying Russia and is crippling his own people. And hopefully there are people on the inside who recognize this and make a move to make a significant change.
Why? Why is he doing this?
This is a good question. I think I would have had a different answer 2 or 3 weeks ago. I'm not so sure right now. Look, he's turning 70 this year. I think when he looks in the mirror, he sees himself standing beside Joseph Stalin, beside Ivan the Terrible. He wants to be a great Russian leader. He has, over the past 22 years, completely failed his own people. Their conditions have not improved since he took power. I just read a report from the Auditor General from a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. 1 in 3 Russian hospitals doesn't even have running water. And so he realizes that he's failed his own people. And I think that, he's clearly stated that he wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union. I think this is part of his just a personal, it's his ego, him trying to build his own legacy. And he truly believes that Ukraine belongs as part of Russia. And this is, I think it's all about his own legacy at this point. He has no interest in his own people. In fact, I've said several times that I think that Vladimir Putin, quite frankly, hates his own people just as much as he hates the people of Ukraine and the Western world. He's never demonstrated otherwise. So, like I said, I think his legacy, there's nothing strategic about this. He's not trying to improve the conditions of his own people or improve anything for Russia. It's all about Vladimir Putin maintaining power, establishing his own historical legacy, and maintaining his own wealth and amassing his own wealth. That's what this is all about.
We're chatting tonight with Marcus Kolga of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute about the war in Ukraine. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Marcus Kolga of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, an expert on Eastern Europe, and we're talking about the war in Ukraine. Marcos, you started out the show by saying that there were crimes taking place in Ukraine. Is Putin, is the Russian army, is the Russian people guilty of war crimes?
Vladimir Putin is definitely guilty of war crimes. I think that the soldiers that are carrying out his orders in Ukraine, who are killing scores and scores of Ukrainian civilians, women, children, mothers, fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers, they're also guilty of war crimes. They're going to be held to account. The sooner the better. But Canadians need to be aware of this, that these war crimes are happening. They are preventable. We can provide Ukraine the tools, and the Ukrainian government, the army, the tools to prevent some of these deaths. And we can also, again, work with our allies to ensure that those refugees who are trying to flee are protected from Vladimir Putin's efforts to kill them, to mow them down, to slaughter them. We have that ability. We need to use those tools. We need to provide the Ukrainians the tools, and we need to help make sure that we prevent the loss of civilian lives right now, because that's what we've seen so far is only a start. And when Kiev is encircled in the coming days, which is entirely possible, things are only going to get much, much worse.
What would you say to the people in Kiev right now?
I've been able to talk to a few of them. I have a friend, Olga, who is a Canadian. She's a Canadian citizen. She immigrated here years ago. She's caught in Ukraine right now. Her father is unable to walk. He's blind. He can't be moved. Olga is not leaving her father right now. She is hearing distant shelling throughout the night. She is terrified. If Russia has its way, if Putin has his way, he'll turn off the electricity. He will cut off the water. She has no way out. Olga is not alone. There are millions of others like her right now who are terrified. They are shivering in their homes in Kiev, terrified of what's to come. Those are the people we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about how we help them get out. And to those people that are, if there is anyone in Kiev listening, we are fighting for you. There are people in Canada, in the United States, in Europe who are advocating for you, and we will fight to try and save you. And we just hope that they remain safe over the coming days and that they survive what's to come.
Marcus, most of our listeners are going to be in the Greater Toronto Area, Canada. Do you have a message for them?
I do. Please think of Ukraine. When you think of Ukraine, it's not this far away place. These are, there's so many Ukrainians that live among us. These are civilians who are, like I said, they're terrified. They never wanted this war. It has just been foisted upon them by Vladimir Putin. And we need to be doing all that we can to help them. And so if they feel like they want to help these Canadians, they need to call their member of parliament. They need to tell them that Canada needs to help supply the Ukrainians with weapons with which to defend them. If they feel like they want to make sure that those refugees are protected, they need to tell their MPs that we want to have no-fly zones, corridors to protect those fleeing refugees. And they can also look up online, the Canadian Ukrainian Foundation, if they want to donate money to Ukrainians. Like I said earlier, this may be Ukraine's battle, but it is all of our battle. This is an assault on our democracy, on democracy in general, and Ukraine's battle is ours. If we don't stop Vladimir Putin now, he is coming for us next, whether it's in the Baltics or whether it's in the Arctic. He's already attacked our democracy and our information space. He is coming for us. We need to stop him now.
Marcus Kolga, thank you so much for joining us and updating us on what's going on. And I think that the way you describe the war in Ukraine as the front line of the war on democracy, I think is very apt. And so I really appreciate you communicating with us all over again. And if there's some updates in the future, please come back. That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thank you to Marcus Kolga for joining us from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videocasts are available on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and the podcasts on Apple, Audible, and Speakeasy. Thanks for joining us. Good night, everybody. Marcus Kolga. Keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on, Brian.